Good morning, everyone. We'll just give a few moments for people to join the session, but welcome. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Nathan Avant, and I am here to welcome you to session 11, Caring for Artist Ephemera in Archival Collections. MARAC wishes to thank the sponsor of this session, University Products. We will be utilizing the live transcript for this session for accessibility purposes. If you'd like to hide the subtitles, please click the live transcription button at the bottom of your application and then select Hide Subtitle. And if your Zoom application is not maximized, you may need to click the three dots or the More icon to turn off the subtitles. Please use the Q&A feature to pose questions to myself and my fellow panelists. We'll see those questions and answer them at the end of the session. Finally, please remember to check the MARAC YouTube page for our pre-recorded poster sessions and the virtual tours at the link that should be in the chat right about now. So we'll go ahead and get started with my first panelist, which is me. As I said, I'm Nathan Avant. I'm the archivist at the Glenstone Museum, and I'm going to talk to you today about caring for artist ephemera in the Glenstone archives. So first, a little bit about Glenstone. Founded with the mission to seamlessly integrate art, architecture, and nature, Glenstone is an indoor and outdoor contemporary art museum in Potomac, Maryland. Glenstone is situated on over 300 acres of organically maintained meadows and woodlands. The museum opened in 2006, and we opened our expansion, the building we call the Pavilions, in 2018. And admission is always free. So the Glenstone Archives consists of 13 collections, which are accessible to our internal audience of Glenstone associates, especially used by our guide and our collections teams. And today I want to talk to you about the Artist Objects and Ephemera collection and the Artist Material Archive. These two collections at Glenstone have provided opportunities for cross-departmental cooperation with the art conservators at Glenstone. So first up is the Artist Objects and Ephemera collection. This collection was created by one of my predecessors as a catch-all collection for objects that are related to the artists and artwork in Glenstone's art collection, and objects that were received by Glenstone staff from outside parties. There's two main themes in this collection. The first is print matter and merchandise that were created by other institutions to promote their exhibitions, but that feature or reproduce a work from our art collection. And then the other main theme is gifts from artists that are part of our collection. And so here's some examples of gifts from artists that are in the Artist Objects and Ephemera collection. So what you see here are the first two items on the left and the center. We have regular correspondence with the artists that we exhibit. One of the things that we take pride in at Glenstone is that we form really personal relationships with our artists. And that often results in them sending us gifts in the mail. And so we regularly receive, as you can see on the left, every December we get a card from the artist Ronnie Horn. This one is a painting collage that's a reproduction of her painting Amazing Grace, but sometimes they're original works that are in card form. And because we receive them in December, we call them the Ronnie Horn holiday cards, but they're almost never holiday themed. In the center, this is a hand-painted postcard from Charles Ray. Charles Ray has a permanent exhibition at Glenstone in room 8 in the Pavilions. And he will regularly send us these lovely hand-painted cards that often represent works that have been on display at the museum. This one is a sculpture of his called Father Figure that was an outdoor sculpture that was on view in 2011. And then on the right, this is a different type of gift from an artist. The artist Alex DeCourt was on site making plans for an installation, and he sketched with pencil on a drawing paper his proposal for how he wanted the flow of the installation to go. Then he handed this sketch to a curator who immediately ran it down to archives and gave it to me to become part of the Artist Objects and Ephemera collection. And something that I noticed right away when I took control of this collection, when I started in December 2019, is that these objects have been declared archives. They've been declared correspondence and ephemera, but they share a lot of the qualities of artworks. They're inscribed by the hand of an artist using various different mediums. And so even though these aren't officially part of the art collection, they're part of the archives collection, I still have to treat them the same way that someone would treat art. And then this is an example of the other major theme from this collection, merchandise created by other institutions. So on the left, this is a painting by John Baldessari called Pure Beauty that was on loan from Glenstone to the Tate Modern in 2015. And they produced these bars of lavender soap representing the work as merchandise promoting their exhibition. And so as part of the loan agreement, we got a copy of all the merchandise. So we got this bar of soap as well. And then on the right, this is the Jeff Koons sculpture Split Rocker, which is permanently installed at Glenstone now. But before it came to Glenstone, it was on view at the Foundation Weiler in Switzerland in 2012. And they produced these ceramic cups to promote that exhibition. So some of the objects in this part of the collection are really straightforward. Posters, pamphlets, maps, these ceramic cups, which are very stable. But some are more complex and can even pose a danger to other objects, such as this soap, which even 8 years later has a very strong lavender scent, which can transfer to other objects if I'm not careful. My background before coming to Glenstone was primarily in digital archives. I had very little experience in object conservation. So in order to properly care for these objects, I decided to leverage the fact that I'm lucky enough to have art conservators in the building where I work. I brought the conservation team down into archives for a series of consultations on how I should be storing and displaying these objects. And luckily for me, their role was mostly reassuring me that everything was fine, but they were able to assist by building custom housings for some items and advising me on how to safely place items in my flat files so that I can provide access to these high interest items without overhandling them. That close consultation relationship with conservation led directly to them reaching out to me about transferring their artist material archive. This collection is made up of materials that were used in the fabrication of artworks, used during the conservation treatment of an artwork, or items that were once part of an artwork but were removed or fell off, such as paint chips or rust. This collection also serves as loan documentation for conceptual works. So here are some examples of artist material archive objects. On the left here we have these are samples of the core tin weathering steel that Richard Serra used to create many of his sculptures, including this one, which is called Sylvester, that's on view at Glenstone. And so we go from these very heavy hunks of metal to these very small samples of organic matter. These were removed from the pools that make up the Felix Gonzalez Torres work Untitled 1992 by a conservator during a normal conservation treatment. She found this organic material gathering at the bottom of the pool and scraped it out, put it in a Ziploc bag so that it could possibly be analyzed later if it became necessary, if it ever showed up again. It went into a drawer in her desk. It became part of the Artist Material Archive, and now I have samples of organic matter in my archives. And then these are examples of the loan documentation function of this collection. My background doesn't really include working with many conceptual artworks, and so this is a new thing for me at Glenstone. But an example here, this is Felix Gonzalez Torres's work, Untitled Chemo, 1991, which takes the form of a beaded curtain that's hung across a passageway in the exhibition space. Glenstone owns this work, but what we actually own are the specifications for the work. It's a concept. And so when we loan the work, we don't transfer any material to the loaning institution. We just give them those specifications, and they're responsible for realizing the work in their space. And so when they have completed their exhibition, as part of the loan agreement, they send us a sample of their version of this work. And so you can see there's 3 examples here, and it's really clear how different the size, the color, the shape even of the beads are from each installation to each installation. And it's always a nice little surprise when a new sample of chemo comes in, because I can see the totally different bead choices that a new institution made. But all of these beads are within the specifications of the work, so they were all legitimate exhibitions of the work Untitled Chemo 1991. So these boxes, as I mentioned, began as conservation's working reference files. They were assembled by the conservation team using conveniently to hand housing materials. They were labeled with notation that was useful to their team, and they often included tape, staples, paper clips, and other fasteners that we don't like to bring into the archives. So it was clear that we needed to apply some library science to the situation. My intern, Alex Brown, you can see here, processed a lot of this collection, and the method that we settled on is bagging each individual item unless it wouldn't fit in one of our bags. So items were double bagged in food safe bags with a printed label placed in between the 2 bag layers. Other housings, such as glass vials and custom boxes, were used as appropriate. Each item had to be considered individually. The conservators were an invaluable resource while processing this collection. Whenever questions arose, we could just walk over and ask them. Our labels expanded on the information from the original hand-printed labels. We added artwork information and loan information where appropriate, and we assigned each item a unique identifier number that refers back to a spreadsheet that has even more descriptive information, processing notes that document exactly what was done with each item. And here's some more examples of processed artist material archive items. On the left, these are electrical ballasts that were once part of the light boxes for large Jeff Wall photo light boxes. These electrical parts were replaced and upgraded, and so the older electrical parts have become part of the artist material archive. And on the right, just showing again some of the variety and diversity of this collection. These are plaster chips that were found at the bottom of packaging from a Bruce Nauman artwork that possibly broke off during transit, possibly just age, but we're keeping them in case they need to be referenced later. So the transfer of this collection was really a net benefit to Glenstone as a whole. It freed up the space in the conservation lab. It freed up the mental bandwidth of the conservation team now that they don't have to manage this collection. It made these items accessible to the whole institution, and that enabled some use cases that just wouldn't have been possible before. Here we have Glenstone guide Ben Rybczynski is preparing to use the Sarah steel samples I mentioned earlier in a touch tour for visually impaired visitors. This is a use case that wouldn't have been possible while these records were part of the departmental files in the conservation office. In addition, I gained significant experience in materials preservation, and I'm really hoping to continue this fruitful cross-departmental relationship with the conservators. And before I wrap up, I wanted to mention the World of Art Conservation has produced a number of online resources that archivists can take advantage of. These two came really highly recommended by the conservation team at Glenstone, and I use them regularly whenever I have a question, is blank safe for the archives? One example, glycine is advertised as being acid-free and archival, but according to the Cameo database, it can begin to break down after 3 to 5 years and is not recommended for long-term use. When I learned this, I did an immediate hunt in my archives for glycine, and I found quite a number of sheets of glycine that had begun to turn brown, had begun to become very brittle, and were starting to flake off. And so I now remove any glycine whenever I see it. Okay, so that's it for me. I am going to hand you off to our next guest, Stephanie Crawford.
Hi everyone, sorry, just gonna share my screen. Cool. There we go. Okay, slideshow. Sorry. Boop boop. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about 2 collections of artist papers that I have processed. And I will try to share some of the ways that I wrangled them. Artist papers especially could present a lot of unique challenges, whether that's due to media or large and complicated ephemera, condition. Oh, so sorry. Okay, let me close webinar chat. Okay, is that better? Sorry. Artist papers especially can present lots of unique challenges due to condition or the different types of ephemera and just like decisions on how to best spend your time. So the first collection that we are going to speak about today is the Miriam Shapiro papers. I was a project archivist at Rutgers University for around 2 years. And I took that time to process the Miriam Shapiro papers. Initially, there were 125 record center cartons. There were about 4 to 5 map drawers of prints and preparatory drawings and around 20,000 slides. Many of the boxes had conflicting arrangement styles. This was largely due to Miriam's like various assistants coming and going. So like one box would be arranged chronologically, one would be arranged alphabetically, and like a bunch of them were just miscellaneous in general. So that was a challenge. And additionally, all of the boxes had like an overall musty smell from where they were initially housed. Luckily we had a preservation person, Tim Corliss, who I'm sure many of you know, and together we evaluated the collection. Overall, for potentially active or active mold, there were only 1 or 2 items that had any issues that we separately addressed. The collection just in general had a bit of a smell. So there were definitely a few issues that I could have talked about today with Miriam's papers, but I wanted to talk about her notebooks specifically. So from the 1940s through the early 2000s, Miriam kept sketchbooks, notebooks, and diaries. Her papers contained 226 notebooks. Originally, they were just kind of piled all on top of each other in record center carton boxes. Her notebooks were also hardly ever one thing. She used them as ways to make lists, to make calendar appointments. She would take notes if she was reading a text. She would write about teaching and teaching issues. And then she also used them as like sketchbooks and to work out problems in her artwork. So in my initial survey of the collection, I spent a lot of time, possibly too much time, pulling out various notebooks and looking at their contents. And because of this, to me, this series was incredibly important because it speaks directly to what Miriam was thinking and reading and feeling and experiencing during really important artistic times in her life. Miriam was involved in the abstract expressionist movement in the 1950s in New York. She was loosely involved in like the computer art beginnings in the 1960s in California. And she and Judy Chicago brought the feminist art program to CalArts, and their work became like a real catalyst for the feminist art movement in California in the 1970s. And she was involved in the New York feminist art movement in the 1980s and 90s. So I knew I wanted to spend a lot of time on this notebook series, but I had to balance this with everything else that needed attention. So if I spent a month on the series, I won't have that time to spend on the other issues and issues that I didn't even know about yet, because that always happens when you're processing. But if I didn't dedicate time to the series, I knew that it had the potential to not function properly for both staff and for researchers. Processing is often intuitive decision making, I find. You need to weigh options, resources, and then decide how you can best help the collection. Okay, so there are 226 notebooks of varying shapes and sizes. Because they were all odd shaped, we couldn't really just purchase 4 flap wrappers. We also really couldn't purchase a ton of supplies to begin with. Most of the money for supplies went to ordering microchamber folders to address the musty smell. Microchamber helps to kind of absorb that smell and protect the collection. So we ended up having to use a lot of scraps and reuse microchamber folders for a wide variety of options. So first thing that I did was I brought all of these notebooks together and I sorted them by size. Those that were thin enough to fit inside of a regular archival folder, I started with first, and this is one of those examples. It's a spiral bound notebook from Miriam's college days, and it has charcoal and pencil sketches in it. And so this guy just went in a microchamber folder and straight into a record center carton, and he was easy peasy. Not all of them are that simple. Each notebook also received a number from 1 to 226. It was written on the inside cover of the notebook and also the folder. This was largely so that if people were to cite them, they would be able to say exactly which notebook, because some of them wouldn't be able to live inside of like a box and folder in like the traditional sense. And it will also end up helping staff to identify them as a way to describe them if they're being pulled for an exhibit or for conservation or preservation, something like that. If the notebook was still small and could fit in a regular size folder like this one, I utilized envelopes. On the left, there's like a general envelope, and made microchamber folder scraps to ensure that the notebook wouldn't fall out of the folder. I used scraps to make a little folder enclosure so that it wouldn't shift around everywhere. Yeah, that's this one, 031. This notebook is another sketchbook of Miriam's from the 1960s. It had some transfer happening because she used some sort of marker on thin paper. So I cut pieces of microchamber paper to interleave between the pages to protect them. And in addition to the numbers assigned to the notebooks, this one is MSN 037. I also added subjects to the notebooks. This was largely based on my initial survey, but also the time spent creating the wrapper or the enclosure. My workflow was essentially that I would create the wrapper or the enclosure, assign the number, skim through the notebooks for clues about dates and topics, and then encode the finding aid. We used oxygen and EAD tags all in one sitting. So subjects for this notebook included computer art, University of California, San Diego, MS Art, but other topics included feminist art program, New York, lists, teachings, and I also wrote the different subjects in the series description so that people could search. And then lastly, I'm going to show you a really bad video of me making a wrapper so you can see how we did it. Notebooks that were too large or thick to really fit in a folder received wrappers to protect them from jostling and wear and tear. Luckily, they were in good enough shape that they didn't really need a clamshell. And again, because we were using scraps, I didn't have big enough pieces to make 4-flap wrappers. I made 2 pieces and then I taped the pieces together. And I'm super not great at this. I'm sharing this so you can see how I did it. I'm sure there are better ways to do it. I struggle with perfectionism, and trying to make these wrappers was really difficult for me, but I just kind of embraced the fact that I wasn't hurting anything and it was fine if things were a little wonky. So essentially you're making 2 pieces, one to go horizontally around and one to go vertically. After you have the 2 pieces cut, you can wrap them around the notebook and make either marks where you should use a bone folder to crease the lines. And I typically make lines and creases while it's wrapped around it. And then you put the 2 pieces together and you try to like make sure that it all fits and that you did it right. I actually managed to do it right here. And then I used double stick tape that you can buy from an archival like resources purchase, Universal Products or Gaylord or however you want to use it. And you tape the 2 pieces together. And then to close the wrapper, I use some Velcro. I'm going to save you a minute of watching me struggle and say I used a piece of Velcro in order to like adhere it closed. And so these notebooks and wrappers that were too large had to be put back into a record center carton because it was going to be stored long-term on a wire shelf in offsite storage. I took AV boxes and stored multiple notebooks without the lid inside of them. And then I put those boxes inside a record center carton as kind of like a little puzzle Jenga, utilizing materials and sources that we didn't really have before. And that's I struggled a lot with that collection, and I know that like it's likely that the wrapper will need to be redone in its lifetime, but for now it's protected and identifiable, and like in general it's okay, and I need to like let go of the perfection thing. maybe that's helpful, maybe it's not. But anyways, the second collection that I'm going to speak super briefly about today is the Caseage Collection at the Mattituck Museum in Waterbury, Connecticut. Caseage was a surrealist artist. She was married to Eve Tungi, also a surrealist artist. She painted and made sculptures, and she was also a poet. She was really an amazing artist. They both lived in Paris, and just before World War II, they fled from Europe and came to live in New York City. But a bunch of their artist friends also lived in Connecticut, and so they ended up purchasing a house and living there until the end of their lives in Woodbury, Connecticut. After their deaths, the estate donated Caseage's archives, some of her personal effects, some of their book collection, and some artwork to the Mattituck Museum. This would have been in like the late 60s, early 70s. And as happens at some small institutions, everything was separated from each other and assigned varying identifying numbers. So in the 1990s, the museum received a grant to hire someone to readdress the collection. But this was largely focused on reassigning numbers to the artwork and the objects. There were a lot of trinkets and things that she owned, jewelry, and like in the late stages of her life, she was making a lot of sculptures. And so she was, there were a lot of little pieces that might have been leftover sculpture material as well. So there will be, so eventually a finding aid of sorts was made, but when I started in 2020, I knew that I wanted to figure out how to make the collections more accessible, but also make it feel like more together and like less separate. So there will be a few researchers who care about, there will be very few researchers, I think, who care about like whether or not something is designated as special collections or archives or in the art collection. Usually people just want to see like everything about Caseage, right? So this section isn't so much about processing as it is about like sharing information and how we can try to make things more interconnected. And so I can't take credit for this, but a huge win in my favor was that the Matitech Museum had decided to transfer their digital asset management system to collective access. And specifically, we were a part of the CLHO, the Connecticut League of History Organizations. We were also members of the Connecticut Archives Online, which is how we were able to make finding aids. A shout out to Western Connecticut State University and CLHO. And specifically what I liked about collective access is that it handles both art and archives items really well. I could build the digital archive materials from the ground up, and this helped me focus on small projects like this that could add a lot of value to the website. Collective access, I didn't really use it to make full finding aids to DAC standards. I always used the CAO to make the full finding aid. But then you can take specific information like scope and content, the biographical element, dates, arrangement, etc., and add them to the collections and collective access. So what you see on the screen is the Caseage Collection, information pulled from the more traditional finding aid. And then at the bottom, there are some digitized objects in the collection that have been associated with this specific collection. This feature was just being rolled out as I left the position to start at the Brooklyn Museum, but I'm really excited about how it allows the digital objects to be visually represented with some elements of the finding aid. I think that this will help people in general to find the collection and use it. I'm not sure how much researchers actually read finding aids. And I feel like this format is visually attractive and might trick them into looking at it for longer. And I'm just gonna play like a 1-minute clip of the search for Caseage. While the archival collection is still very separate, if you just do a general search for Caseage, you get everything, which I find really great. So you get her books of poetry, you get her artworks and drawings, you get the books Minotaur that she collected. And then you get all her little trinkets at the same time at the bottom. And I think that this feature really allows, and this type of digital asset management system really allows the items to live together, which is great. Look at that weird egg. She definitely was going to make something with that egg. She has a lot of things with eggs. So that's me. I'm going to pass the baton to Kara Howe. Thank you guys.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see me now. I'm going to share my screen. All right, and we'll get started. So thanks, Stephanie, for the handoff. Today, I'm going to discuss the particulars of the portrait collection at SUNY Upstate Medical University. Though outside the scope of the typical academic archives collection, stepping in as caretakers for these artworks had a really positive impact on the department's reputation on campus. And most importantly, it gave us control over an annual operating budget. So I came to Upstate in 2014 as the curator for historical collections. There had been no curator or collections care person for ASC from 2008 until 2014. I was stepping into a void that presented opportunities for re-envisioning the department's role on campus. At the same time, there existed a loose collection of portraits that had been commissioned at various points in the university's history. Some reached back to the days of the Syracuse University College of Medicine, a predecessor of the current SUNY institution, while most featured prominent administrators, clinicians, and faculty from the Upstate era. An endowment existed to fund new portraits and was overseen by a former dean of the College of Medicine who was single-handedly developing the collection, but not caring for what was already in place. In the absence of any art gallery on campus or museum, there was no collections care person except myself. I do have a second degree in museum studies, and though my focus had been history museums, I saw an opportunity to use this training in service to the university. The portraits were in pretty rough shape. Many had been hung in less than ideal environments. It was evident that Physical Plant had been asked to install the pieces, but had done so in a way they would hang any other office space art. The worst offender was a particularly large 4.8 by 4.5 foot portrait, which hung above the surgery registration desk in the main hospital lobby. When I took this piece off the wall, the single screw holding it in place actually came right out of the drywall. Luckily, nobody was hurt. The archives had no dedicated budget or operating funds at this time. Any money we spent came directly from the library's allocation. The library was already dealing with structural underfunding, and there was little room in the budget for our expenses. Library administration was reticent to increase their budget requests for anything other than additional licensed content. This also meant we had very few resources to devote to the portraits, and the library wasn't particularly interested in taking on fiscal responsibility for the collection. At the time of my arrival, the collection contained 55 portraits. The majority of these were standard acrylic on canvas, but a few were pretty unique in medium. A World War II era portrait painted using linseed oil-based house and boat paints on a sailboat canvas was one of the more interesting. The portraits were scattered across campus in locations ranging from academic building corridors to private conference rooms in the hospital. Many were located in event spaces and were showing damage like staining from wine splashes and dents where the works had clearly been struck. Some were in very public places, but provided no information on the work or the individual depicted, and no indication that they were part of a larger portrait collection. The archives received many requests for information about these individuals, and we spent a lot of time answering repeat questions. The paintings that were sequestered in department offices or conference rooms were never seen by anyone outside of those departments. All the frames were different, and this did and still does complicate conservation efforts, as well as proper mounting and installation. Frames selected by notable artist Jerome Whitcomb, for example, offered virtually no support or protection for the piece, as the canvas extended outside the forward margins of the frame. The frames had such a thin profile that we actually had to affix the hanging hardware to the stretcher mount that the canvas was attached to, which is not ideal. In the case of our carpet portrait of Gordon D. Hoople, which was commissioned from a textile artist in Iran, the carpet tassels had actually been folded back and glued to the frame backing. What little background information was available on these pieces was kept in the office of that emeritus dean who was funding the new commissions. And while this individual certainly did their best to support the collection, these records needed to be transferred to the archives to ensure their preservation. After internal condition assessments proved that there were significant condition problems for many pieces and strong concern that the current installation practices would increase the number of problems, we submitted a budget request to allow us to bring in professional conservators to do a formal condition survey. I was pleasantly surprised to find that Finance Administration readily agreed to this expense. We're fortunate to have a world-class team of conservators in Central New York, and we contracted Westlake Art Conservators to complete the work. Over the span of a week, Westlake unframed, photographed, and assessed each piece in our collection. The resultant reports allowed us to triage the paintings and decide which needed immediate attention. The noted condition issues ranged from food, drink, and tobacco stains to abrasions, tears, and even the obvious dent from an errant elbow. Some of this was evident to the naked eye, but all of it became readily apparent under raking light photography and using other techniques employed by the conservators. Westlake provided us with all the imaging taken during the survey, as well as detailed reports for each work. Some of the works had no concerning damage and needed very little conservation work. However, knowing that we would not be able to control the environment around them at all, we knew preventative measures were needed for all pieces. These basic preventative measures included affixing backing board to close off the rear of the canvas, while also adding museum-grade glass to the front. Sometimes this required new rabbets to extend the frame or an entirely new frame to accommodate the glass. We were able to prioritize those needing treatment ahead of those that would benefit from preventative measures and allocated needed funds to handle as many portraits as possible each fiscal year. The outcome of the conservation treatments really speaks for themselves. Even in this condensed size, viewed through a computer screen, the improvements are very obvious. The conditions survey, though an immense amount of work in the short term, actually provided the department with a comprehensive plan for properly caring for the artworks, and the project was featured in multiple campus publications. Westlake's lead conservator, Susan Blakeney, and myself were interviewed on Upstate's radio show, and a feature article was included in the winter 2017 edition of Upstate Health magazine. The publicity brought the department that had not existed just 2 years before to the forefront of campus conversations. It helped me grow my network of campus connections and foster goodwill among our alumni population. Anything we could do to increase awareness of our presence with that alumni group paid off with additional materials donations and financial support for the department. Most importantly, our CFO felt the expense was worthwhile and reached out to express his gratitude. An online exhibit curated in Omeka provides a biography of the individual in the portrait, artist information, if we know that, and the campus location for the piece. This allows the collections to be considered as a whole, despite the disparate physical locations. Portrait cards have been installed alongside the framed pieces, and a QR code points viewers to the online exhibit. We no longer have to answer those repeat questions about the individuals featured in the portraits. The occasional question that does come in is quickly answered by simply sending the link to the exhibit. The exhibit benefited greatly from the information we gathered during the conservation survey. For example, before unframing the portrait of Dr. Stephen Smith, we had no information about the artist who had produced it. It turns out that that piece was painted by John D. Barrow, a prolific portrait and landscape artist of the later 19th century. Nearly 400 of Barrow's works are owned by the Barrow Gallery in Skaneateles, New York, which also happens to be where Westlake Conservators' studios are located. So a really interesting connection. Sharing this exhibition online has allowed our collection to reach a broader audience. The Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse saw the exhibit and reached out about one of our pieces that was painted by Daryl Hudo, an American post-war and contemporary painter who is not known for producing many portraits. Our piece, which was a portrait of Mr. Hudo's neighbor and longtime faculty member, Gregory Threet, was loaned to the Everson for an exhibition of Hudo's work called From Diamonds to Sailboats. The funds for the conditions survey were intended to be a one-time allocation. A special fund request memo had been submitted outlining the need for the work, including an analysis of 3 potential conservators and a financial argument for selecting Westlake. The argument really came down to their close proximity to campus, which allowed us to forego the prohibitive cost of fine art shipping. They came right to campus to conduct the survey. Their travel fees were immensely reasonable, given that it was only about a 45-minute drive. Our department had been assured of an additional annual allocation of $10,000 that could be used to deal with the conservation issues over time. We anticipated being able to handle approximately 2 portraits in particularly bad shape, or 3 to 4 requiring less intensive work each year. We were moving along with this funding model for the first couple of years, when unexpectedly our 2018-19 annual budget jumped back up to the original amount allocated for the conditions survey. Knowing this was likely an accounting error, we took necessary steps to inform the finance office, but also leveraged the opportunity to explain how we might use these additional funds if we were allowed to expend them. We explained how work similar to what was being done for the portraits was needed for other portions of our holdings, and how those materials contained valuable information, historic documents, rare books, and antique medical and laboratory equipment. We were told to use the additional funds for that year. To our surprise, the next fiscal allocation was once again at that additional $22,000 number. We happily spent the money again. Like the rest of campus, our department saw a 20% allocation cut due to COVID. So since that 2020-2021 cut, our budget has increased annually at the rate of inflation right along with campus. We have not seen that 20% added back, but we have continued to grow. We've recently been asked to begin to submit a department budget request each year, and we have submitted those budget requests at that rate of inflation each year. We've had no dispute over the allocation and have not pointed it out as an error again. This money has allowed us to purchase archival housing, scanning equipment, storage and exhibition furniture, and pay for software licenses like archive space without impacting the library's ability to license content. It has been an immense relief not to feel in competition with other necessary library initiatives. In keeping with the original spirit of the allocation, If the expenditure serves our collections directly, we believe it to be justifiable. We have not used our budget to fund new portraits. Portraits are supported by institutional funds, the existing endowment through the Dean of the College of Medicine office, or through crowdsourcing and fundraising efforts. As of spring 2023, 22 portraits have been conserved by Westlake. This includes all the pieces with a priority level 1 or level 2 status after the condition report. The remaining pieces are no longer at high risk, but preservation work continues at a regular pace until all the pieces are in proper housing. The collection now numbers 61 pieces and includes multiple new commissions and also a few found pieces that have been hiding around campus. Locations for all pieces are known and documented. Some of them are in storage in our vault while new locations are selected, and each piece is clearly labeled as under the purview of our department. Office moves, renovations, and other facilities changes have all successfully alerted us to possible relocation or damage concerns, and we've been able to mediate the process. New commissions are properly documented now, and a policy exists to standardize that process, while also ensuring that more marginalized members of the upstate community are recognized and featured in these new commissions. But I think that's probably a topic for another presentation. When considering the costs to the department weighed against the benefits we've seen, I consider the portrait collection to be an asset to ASC. Despite the obvious work it has generated for our staff, it is solely responsible for the financial resources available to care for all of our holdings. There continues to be work towards conservation efforts, but this has been operationalized and is not overly difficult. After the death of the Emeritus Dean, ASC now leads the efforts to commission new portraits, which allows us to keep those commissions within the scope of what we can care for. No more 5 foot by 5 foot commissions. The department head chairs a campus-wide committee that accepts nominations for new commissions, and we maintain a campus policy to control the process. We are the liaison between the university and the artist chosen for the new work, and we work with a local framer and with Westlake to ensure that new pieces are properly housed. Despite this short-term time commitment, the long-term cost and time savings in not needing to care for these new portraits is crucial. The early work done on the portrait collection is partially responsible for staffing growth in the department. We increased from my 1 position to 3 full-time faculty positions in less than 6 years. That was spurred by an increased awareness of the department and all of its services and collections. While the financial benefits were due in part to an accident in campus accounting software, these other benefits and growth were spurred by the thoughtful and conscious way that the department identified the need and addressed it. New portraits will not join the ranks of those needing intense treatment or preventative care. We have been asked to help with other art initiatives on campus, and I spent a fascinating 6 months helping to select art for the newly constructed ambulatory care building. Positive publicity and increased word of mouth has spread through the alumni community, and we've seen an increase in financial donations and a significant increase in new materials coming into the archives, due in large part to the efforts around the portrait collection and the notice that they generated. And if you have any questions for the presentation, please just pop those into the Q&A session, and I will now turn it over to Ben.
Okay. Okay, so I'm in the webinar. Can people hear me, or I'm sorry? Yes,
Ben, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
good. Nope, there it goes. I was just going to offer a suggestion, but you're ready.
Actually, that's the wrong shared screen. I think what I'll do, I did not put my presentation in Google Drive. I've got it on my desktop, and I can't apparently share that.
It might just be right behind your web browser if you minimize your web browser.
Okay.
Up in the top right corner.
Oh, I can bring it up. Yeah.
Yep.
Very good idea. Sorry for the delay here.
There you go.
Yes.
If you click slideshow in the top nav. Yep. Keep going to the right.
Oh, there it is.
I would say not now in that little box and then go from beginning. There you go.
Okay. Okay, so should I go ahead and start? Can everybody hear me? Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the delay. This is the first time I've actually done this. I should have run through it earlier. So I guess we've got about 25 minutes. So I'm going to run through real quick. I've kind of had a family medical emergency, so I haven't relating to my mom's elder care and a stroke that she had a couple weeks or like 2 weeks ago, and I've been kind of back and forth between Ohio. So I do apologize that I don't have the slideshow completely prepared the way I'd like it, but I'm going to add to it. And then if anyone wants a copy of the slideshow directly emailed to them, just go ahead and put your email address in the chat. And of course, it'll be up on Merrick's archival website for the conference. Okay, so let me get started. Just to put it in context of the rest of the panelists. So I'm work in a labor and social justice archives, the George Meany Memorial Archives at the University of Maryland, and I'm the labor and social justice archivist. So a lot of my work has to do with bringing material about the labor movement to the campus, to the students on campus, and then a lot of outreach work to the labor movement itself. We have the national records of the AFL-CIO. That's approximately 45,000 boxes of material, text material, and there are tens of thousands of artifacts, AV, photographs, and so forth. So I'm kind of coming from a more traditional archives versus one specific to art. We don't have any, the labor archives doesn't have any dedicated exhibit space. We were able to do an exhibit in our main gallery every 5 years, and then we do a mini 30-day exhibits about once or twice a year in our research room. So we don't really have kind of a traditional gallery type space that would be connected to a art museum or art archives. And also, I think it was interesting. I thought I was struck by Nathan's comments about personal relationships with artists. Like for our archives, we don't really have that except for maybe a couple photographers. But our relationship is more with union leaders and their family members. And I'll give an example, like the great grandson of George Meany, who was president of the AFL-CIO for many years, and was at the founding convention 55. He was the guy who merged the two labor federations. The family came in and I started searching through the artifacts, and there were all kinds of things they didn't know they had. They talked about memories of things like an organ that the family used to play. We actually have that in the archives and they didn't even know it. And so that's kind of some of the crazy things we end up with. And we've got an original George Meany's last box of cigars and A lot of times when they closed their office, when they passed away, they basically shipped everything to the archives because at that time it was an official AFL-CIO operation before it came to the University of Maryland. So I think some of the archivists didn't want to, ruffle any feathers. So we got all kinds of crazy artifacts, baby shoes from Sam Gompers, the founder of the AFL, back in 1881. We have a cigar he rolled before he became leader of the AFL, those kind of things. But really what I've learned, I've only been here since 2016, but what I've learned is that I need to really shift the emphasis rather than traditional labor movement and however nostalgic and fun a lot of these artifacts are that we have in our collection, that I really need to shift more towards the young generation and the activist generation in Black Lives Matter and the women's marches and Stand for Ukraine and in labor, the bakery workers, Starbucks, Amazon. And I want to really focus on bringing out material that will kind of spark interest in the students here on campus and young apprentices and members of the union movement about like what is the labor movement and interesting things that will attract their attention to do more in-depth research and maybe even start like a history club at their local union or the student activists doing collections on campus or even tipping us off to some donors that a lot of the parents of people at Maryland are from union families. I think we have a bricklayer on our board of trustees, vice president of bricklayers. So my approach is more about like, how do you deal with artwork that you've gotten? It's now artifacts in the archives, kind of a more traditional archives. And at the same time, I want to kind of transform our approach into strictly labor into broader social justice, as I mentioned. And this presentation is kind of a beginning of, it's part of the effort. My goal is to write a handbook on social justice archives that would be aimed at local unions, community organizations, the big social movements like Black Lives Matter. So this is kind of a rough outline of DIY archives for community and social movement archivists. So let's get started. My first slide is that's a little table, exhibit table I set up this pre-pandemic at the local chapter meeting of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, the local chapter in Washington, D.C. And it was at the Electrical Workers Union Hall, which is actually bigger than our library. They have like 10,000 members. And so A. Philip Randolph was the founding organizer for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was primarily a Black union. They had a few members, white members in Canada, not in the US because of segregation. This was in the 1920s. So he became one of the greatest labor leaders in the history of the United States that is little known by people outside the labor movement. And so he helped found with Bayard Rustin, again, really important leaders and really responsible for the 1963 March on Washington and the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Those two individuals, probably more than anyone else in the United States, are responsible for those laws and the mobilization in 1963, which included 40,000 union members. So A. Philip Randolph is this amazing figure in the labor. I mean, he's passed away now, but he's an amazing figure. So out of a union council meeting, one of the actual local organizer for the A. Philip Randolph Institute invited me to their local meeting. So I set up this table, and one of the artifacts, you'll see there, that's some of the members of the A. Philip Randolph Institute. The woman in the reddish orange dress is president, at that time, Jackie Jeter, she's president of Metro AFL-CIO, and really great. She helped donate the AFL-CIO's local district records, which has over 100,000 members. Great labor leader, came out of the Transit Workers Union. I'm working with her now to develop an archives program for the transit workers, in particular, looking at the role of bus drivers in the civil rights movement. That's something I really want to talk about erased history, bring that back, and through the union. So you'll see there also in the, you'll see the little statue there. That was a model statue, you know, and I forgot to check who the artist was, but of A. Philip Randolph, that the full statue is in Union Station in downtown Washington, D.C. If you go where the Starbucks, right where the Amtrak trains come in, the Starbucks, which is now shut because they organized the union, and Starbucks shut them down, but the statue is right across from there. And I'm hoping to work with the A. Philip Randolph Institute to work on restoring that statue because some of the parts are missing. And this effort was kind of a very beginning of that. And it kind of gives you an example of how I want to shift the emphasis from traditional labor archives more towards social justice, and in particular, in this case, A. Philip Randolph Institute. So I apologize. Again, this is going to be a bare bones outline. I'm going to run through this real quick so there's plenty of time for discussion. We've only got 15 minutes left. So I'm going to run through this, but I will upgrade this, get illustrations and so forth. So I've taught, you know, traditional archives. I think everybody knows about that. Social justice, I kind of already talked about that. But I'm working on actually taking it a little step further of what I'm considering like embedded archivists in the social movements. So I go out and have since 2013, go out and collect artifacts, mostly that are left behind at the women's marches, Stand With Ukraine and Black Lives Matter. And that's a big part of what I'm trying to figure out how to, it's basically artwork that I'm trying to figure out how to best preserve and make acceptable. So I think one of the things that I won't talk about a lot here because we don't really have time, but I've been thinking a lot about what does activist archivists mean? And I think for me, it's that supporting community-driven archives, and we have the Document Now program here in the same building here of the Maryland Institute, Myth. It's the Maryland Institute for Humanities and Technology, and they focus on kind of social media archiving for community organizations. And I'm kind of extending that into more of, in some ways, traditional in the sense of collecting physical objects versus social media. But I think at some point we want to get into social media. It's just, you know, how much time we've got. I'm the only full-time employee of the labor archives. The rest of the employees are student assistants. So basically I'm in charge of managing 40,000 feet and making it accessible to researchers around the world. So it's kind of busy. I got a researcher from Poland right now in our reference room. Okay, so in terms of specific things, I'm gonna, and I'll really get into more detail on this, but one of the things I'm trying to do, not only do kind of fairly traditional archival storage, but also kind of create mobile storage in the stacks that can be easily wheeled out to the research room, including like a collection of posters. We have t-shirts, want to put them on a clothing rack and be able to wheel them out for classes in our instruction room. Hats are, you know, real similar kind of thing. We have a big hard hat collection I'm trying to figure out what to do with. Buttons are extremely popular among students, and we have thousands of them. So it's just a matter of getting them organized by theme and being able to present them easily to students. And then artifacts, a lot of the stress that I'm going to try to develop are low-cost methods that are effective in preserving things. Because one of the big problems with the high-end archival material, particularly for community organizations, is it's really expensive. So I'm trying to figure out ways that we can kind of DIY solutions that are good solutions, but also cost-effective for community organizations. Digitization, we are lucky to have huge resources in that. We have for two-dimensional images, we've got Archelon, a new system just up, and then we've got Archive Space, and we've also got Avalon, which is for moving images. All this has come together in the last couple of years. And so our goal, like for me, the key goal is to link digital objects to records in archive space. And we're talking about that. It's just a matter of having the coders and the support to do that. But one of the things, for example, in kind of more a traditional vein, we have this huge collection of labor cartoons that's over 4,600 items. 2/3 of those are original artwork. They've all been traditionally processed at the item level, and we have the guide in archive space at the item level, but we don't have any images. So I want my views in the huge volume that we've got is I want to be able to do selected images, and also including of things like protest signs from the Women's March and current social movements. Okay, so that's it. I guess we've got 15 minutes for discussion. Please email me if you have any questions, and I guess we'll have a discussion. So let me see if I can figure out how to exit out of here. Sorry.
Ben, you can actually just stay. If you stop share, everyone, I'll just bring all of our panelists out.
Okay, very good. I'm learning a lot today. Okay.
Excellent. So we have answered some of the questions in the Q&A in text form. So we'll go through other ones, and if you have more questions, feel free to post them in there during this discussion. Sort of starting from the bottom, I'm going to try to group them together by presenter. So this is a question for Kara from William C. Fascinating and well done presentation. Everything seems to have worked out well. What was your biggest challenge? Convincing the administration to get initial funding? Convincing them that this was really important?
Thanks for your question, William. So I think actually I was shocked at how easy it was to get that initial round of funding approved. I think there was something to be said for making it like a one-time ask that had a clear fixed dollar amount. I actually chose the portrait collection as sort of a first big ask because people had already been pointing it out as a problem, saying that they wished somebody would deal with that. And it seemed like if I could find a way to make that work and demonstrate the value for the department, that we could get the ball rolling and go from there. So it was a surprisingly easy ask that first time. And then we just got lucky, honestly, with that accounting error. But again, it was surprisingly easy to hold on to the money. I think it was just a matter of having a good prepared ask and a demonstrated value, and then going from there. I think the harder part after that was expanding the programs and getting the additional staff and stepping into digital archiving and those kinds of things that don't have such a clear, very visual product at the end of it. The artwork is so very upfront and everybody can see it, and it was really easy to say, look how awful this was and look at how great it became. So this was actually an easier lift than some of the other initiatives that we did afterwards, but this really paved the way.
So let's see, we have, I guess there's a couple of questions for me that I can just quickly answer. The first one's from D. Bowers. Nathan, do art historians or other researchers ever access the artist materials collection? The answer for that is unfortunately not yet. We just finished processing this last summer, and the Glenstone Archives isn't really visible and not necessarily set up for external access right now. It's something that we're really, it's a very strong goal to make ourselves available to outside researchers, and we are on kind of a case-by-case basis. If someone has a distinct research question and they email us, we can work something out. But it's a little hard for people to even know it exists right now since we're not exposed. We don't have our database online or anything like that. But I would love for that to happen in the future. And then the other question for me is, From Emily Dunn, as you're dealing with living collections, have you developed a policy about what gets added to your collections, especially materials from conservation? Also, are you dealing with any digital artwork? It would seem there would be a lot of conservation materials related to the upkeep of that kind of work. So yes, I do have a collection development policy. It's a little tricky as a small, relatively small institution and a small team to say no to things, and so I try to have a clear collection development policy so that I can, reject things that are outside of scope. But when it comes especially to the Artist Material Archive, it's so, the scope is kind of broad. It's, any materials that were attached or were used in the treatment of an artwork. And so I end up taking most things. And as far as digital artwork goes, all of the digital artwork management is done by the conservation department, and all of the little bits and bobs and proxy files and all of that are all managed by them. But as I mentioned, I have a background in digital preservation, in particular television. I worked at the Smithsonian Channel, and so I have kind of a reverse consultation relationship with them, where I advise them on digital preservation and on how to preserve video files. And so there's a question sort of for the broad group. Can anyone speak to working with oversized artist work and making those accessible online? For example, set designs and book blueprints. And that's from Brooke Leffler. Can anyone speak to that?
I can't speak to those more documents type artist ephemera pieces. But we had to do photographs, obviously, with paintings of this size, especially the ones that were approaching like 5 foot by 5 foot framed. We had to use a camera setup. So that was how it worked for us. But I think you're probably looking for digitized versions that can zoom and have all of that interactive capability so that people can interact with the detail in the drawings. And that wasn't something that I've done, not for this project. And we're stepping a toe into it at Colgate right now, but we don't have the full workflow. We're going to outsource it. We're going to do it with a vendor.
Yeah, that makes sense.
At Rutgers University, we had some oversized artworks and prints and preparatory drawings from Miriam's collection. And so we used, again, like an oversized camera setup that was on like a pole, so the camera could move up to like capture a very large item. And we digitized those primarily so that researchers would be able to see those instead of like bringing them out every time someone wanted to see them. I think making things accessible online is great, but you also have to consider, the intellectual property rights of the artist and the artist's estate. Luckily, we knew Miriam's estate well, so and I think they continue to know the estate well. So if they are interested in, putting preparatory works or prints online, images of prints online, they would definitely have to work with the estate in order to figure out how best to represent Miriam in that way.
Great. And I think we have one more question that's for the group, and that is from Ilhan Sitak. I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. Do you have any library guides or lesson plans for teaching with primary sources or teaching with objects from the collections you talked about? For myself, the answer is no, not really. We do, but like as I showed, with the touch tour, I do make my archival items available to our school group people that manage the school groups, and they do incorporate those into teaching moments when schools visit the museum. But if anyone else can speak to that, please go ahead.
I don't either.
It's a great idea. I support it.
Yes, we do a fair amount of teaching with primary sources. Unfortunately, we haven't had time to actually write up formal lesson plans and that thing. If you, I mean, there are quite a few publications about this, so you probably already are aware. But the SAA website, there's, I think, at least a couple of books published on it. I think in general, what we've found in using artwork, artifacts in the classroom is you want to upfront get the students engaged in the artwork rather than doing a lecture or something like that. Get, kind of briefly introduce it, get them engaged, and then start talking about kind of what an archives is, why did we save this, that kind of thing, usually with like a little question sheet on analyzing the artifacts. Another quick response to the super oversized objects, that's a big problem with us. We've outsourced a couple of things, but we have literally hundreds of items that are super oversized. And what we want to do is what Stephanie was talking about, do a DIY mount for a camera. I'm actually thinking of putting it on a moving thing so we can do banners, but I'll put that in the slideshow, kind of at least a plan. But that's something that'd be great to share about, because if you can do it in-house, it's really very inexpensive. Oh, another note on the oversize is when I was at the University of Baltimore, we had all these archival drawings of houses, and we basically asked the homeowners would contact us and we'd have them pay for it with a little bit of a service charge. So that's one thing too you might want to look into.
Great, and I think we are over our time. Thank you everybody for your great questions and for listening to us. And I hope you have a great rest of your conference.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.